So you've heard a lot about OSGi, modularity. You've heard a lot about new functionality, new ways of building extensions in Liferay. Whoa. Hope that's not a Liferay instance that just failed. But where are you now? You have a bunch of Liferay. Presumably you have a Liferay instance, and presumably you have some set of plugins that you have developed, you or your customers or the people who work for you. So that's an existing code base that you're maintaining. You potentially, I'm assuming that if you're here, you're interested in migrating to Liferay 7 at some point in the future. And you want to know what the implications are for your existing code. So just a little terminology here. We're just adopting a couple of terms, and just to clarify what we imagine and what we would propose for you to think of when you're considering moving to the Liferay 7. And there's two different phases to what you might want to tackle as far as taking a traditional plugin and moving it to the new extensions, OSGi bundles. And one is the migration versus the conversion. And Dave Trong talked about it a little bit, and I'm going to go into a little bit more details and just talk about the issues and the reasoning why you want to do these things. One is the migration, which is the thing that you've been doing more or less since the beginning, since you've started working with Liferay, which is when you do an upgrade, you basically change your SDK to point to a new Liferay version, or you rerun the SDK tool, and then you identify all the compile errors, and you start to go through those until they're fixed, and then you deploy, and then you go through all the JSP failures, fix all those, and then you go through all of the other stuff, all the JavaScript, all the CSS, and whatnot, right? That's the actual API breaking stuff that you must do whenever some library has been changed or some API has been changed, and that's really no different. Hopefully it's different in the future, but as far as that should be the same from any previous upgrade that you've done, and Dave Trong just talked about the upgrade process. So we're gonna talk specifically about the code conversion. So the migration is the taking a legacy plugin and just making it work as it were. And then conversion. And then conversion is converting it to then an OSGi. But we want you to divide these two things one from the other. I wouldn't imagine it would be necessarily a good idea to take something that doesn't compile yet in a legacy form of a plugin and try to shoehorn that into OSGi. We recommend that you first make it just work in its current native format, which is a traditional plugin, which is a WAR. Have that work first. And then later on at your leisure, when you have time, then you could convert it if necessary. You can convert it to OSGi. And this is an optional, of course. We're going to talk a little about more detail, but it's not always necessary to do this conversion. So the first one, the migration, the outcome of the migration process is, of course, just still a traditional plugin or WAR. But the conversion result is actually the output is OSGi bundle or bundles, whichever the case may be. So migrate now, migrate as early as you can, but convert at your convenience as soon as it's feasible for you. It's not it's an optional process. So do it based on the need that you have. So migration. Migration is moving the traditional plugin to a new version of Liferay. So again, like I said, you have to fix all the API changes. And David brought up a very interesting point that Liferay IDE 3.0 will have a very cool tool, and actually it'll be a tool that's also accessible from a command line through what we call the Blade tool client, command line interface, is the Liferay migration tool, which is intended to be an adaptable and upgradable tool that will be more and more intelligent the more people use it. Not on its own, but through adding more converters to it. So this tool itself is an OSGi runtime in which we can add more plugins into. So this migration tool, it's been built explicitly to be continuously updated. It's probably not going to be feasible, or it's probably not going to be the case, rather, not that it's not feasible, but we probably won't catch all of the upgrade issues that are possible in this conversion process, because the matrix of change from what you've done and what we expect people to do is going to be significantly different. But what we're hoping to do is that the migration tool can be added. You can add new converters to it, which you can actually contribute those back. And this tool will be open source, and we want the community to contribute to it. We're going to put as many converters in there. Conversions is basically fixing some code issue or some configuration issue, and either basically doing the best thing that we can. If we could fix the issue outright, then the output will be a fixed solution. If it can't fix it because it requires human intervention, then it'll basically make a suggestion for what the fix should look like. So, like Dave said, it's going to be a report, but as many things as we can just automatically fix, we will fix, such as an import package change. We know that this package moved from this to something else, and so we can just rewrite that. So this is a very, very important tool. It's a new thing that Liferay is working really hard for. The tooling team is really committed to doing this. And then conversion. So conversion is actually moving to a plugin to OSGi, right? However, what we're calling a module, which is, again, just an OSGi bundle, it doesn't use the traditional Liferay project structure. So when you're taking a legacy plugin and you're converting it to OSGi, we really want you to have the freedom to structure those projects any way you like. And likely, we would recommend that you follow the Maven model, because that's going to be applicable as well in Gradle. The beautiful thing is that you'll be converting from a war model to just a plain old jar. So all of your plugins will just, even though they're still web bundles, they still have servlets in them, they still have JSPs, they will just be pure OSGi bundles. And then obviously the difference between just a plain old jar and a module is that there's this additional metadata, right? Which we're going to have some configuration files to configure the tool that builds the output, which is BND. So the big question is obviously migration is necessary, so that's fine. You need to migrate. You need to fix the API issues. But when do you convert? And these are my recommendations. If you have a module or a plugin that has a lot of code in it, then it's probably a candidate for being migrated. And the reason being that if there's lots of code in it to the point where there's many developers collaborating on this concurrently and wanting to make concurrent changes to it, it's probably a good candidate to have separated out. This actually can increase your productivity and the agility to release more frequently. Or if the module itself is just being change so frequently, then that's also another indication that it should probably be restructured. So if you have a plugin that every month you have to redeploy a new version of it because it's constantly getting a new feature or whatnot, then it's likely that it's badly structured. And this is actually one of the problems that we had in Liferay. We had so many developers. One, we had lots of code. Two, we wanted to make frequent change, and it was all in the same code base. So the solution is just to split those out so that smaller teams could work on more different parts. Or if you have a plugin that simply just has some reusable parts that you want to consume from elsewhere. You have some business logic that you have an expertise in, and then you're reusing that in multiple different projects, as opposed to copying that code into several different wars and deploying that to different customers. You can just make those parts OSGi modules, and then they're just deployed to into your different clients in your different scenarios, and have different consumers of that reusable components. This goes back to what Jorge and what Tim were talking about in the keynotes about just the reuse and the reusable building blocks. And finally, if you really just want to take advantage of OSGi features, which are many, so there might be a lot of reasons for why you would take just a regular old plugin and convert it to OSGi, because there's just so many benefits. You want to benefit from the service model. You want to use remoting transparently. You want to use a configuration management. You want to be able to re-architect your deployment in a composable way. Any of those things. So when not to convert, you have a portlet, let's say, that's using JSR 168 or 286 compatibility, and you still want to be able to deploy that into another app, into another portlet container. If you want to retain that compatibility, maybe it's not necessary to do this conversion. Maybe you just want to stick with the traditional model. Or you're using a complex legacy web framework, which is really tied to the Java EE programming model, like maybe JSF, or using Spring MVC or something like this, and the amount of work necessary to make that work in OSGi is more than you feel is necessary or warranted, then just stay with the traditional model. Or if your plugin interacts with the app server, the app server visibility is going to change dramatically this is actually a benefit to both you and to Liferay. By distancing our plugins from the app server, it means that they're much more portable, and we can remove a lot of contingent code that does different behaviors based on the app server. And also unifies the class loading model, because different app servers have different class loader models, and so that makes it very difficult for us to manage plugins and how their class loading is going to work. So if you have a plugin that connects to the app server directly, using the features and functionalities, then you probably don't want to migrate that. So it's going to be a trade-off. There's also a dot here. Really, what it boils down to is what are the cost benefits versus what are the benefits versus the costs. If you have a plugin that's a legacy portlet, and its original intent was to be a limited lifetime, like you have a marketing campaign, you built a specific portlet for it, and it's done in 6 months, then obviously there's probably not a good reason for you to convert that to OSGi. Just throw it away when you're done with it, and it should work as it is once you've converted it, once you've migrated it to Liferay 7. And then the benefits of conversion. Basically, you can take a single application and break it down into building blocks, smaller, easier to manage modules, which will allow you to have a much better release process. You can fix bugs in submodules or part modules without affecting the entirety of the application or having to re-release the entire application. And they can be updated individually and whatnot, independently. And lastly, it's about modularity. That's the most significant benefit here. So a Liferay 7 module is literally an OSGi bundle. And so you're benefiting from a standard jar format, You're just adding some additional metadata, and you don't have to deal with XML descriptors anymore, which is going to be a big benefit. And then again, it's been talked about, dependencies are explicitly defined, and the purity of the class space that a bundle sees, right? When it declares its dependencies properly, if the class loader that it has to work with is pristine, it's pristine based because it's only going to see what it requested to see. And so this increases the safety net that you have, that each bundle is working in. And so here's the breakdown of what Liferay is what Liferay 7 looks like versus before. Before, the blue circle would have been the entirety with no subcomponents, right? And then the dark blue portlet applications were in the app server, and then they were visible through the global shared class space of the app server. But here, if you look at the green section, which is the OSGi container inside of Liferay, again, you can see it doesn't touch the app server. It's pure, but it has OSGi core services. It has Liferay core services. It has configuration admin, which is an OSGi service. Then it has the HTTP service. But then you can see it has API bundles, and those can be shared. And this is basically, instead of being, the visibility here is like a graph. So one bundle can communicate with multiple other bundles, and they don't even need to go through the portal to do that. They can directly see each other, which is a huge benefit for reuse or for composing application pieces. Finally, in the conversion process, one of the biggest assets that we're going to have is Liferay IDE 3.0, which will ship support specific for Liferay 7. It's going to support like an archetype for building Liferay 7 modules. It's going to have project support for those modules. It's going to integrate Blade tools, which is the tool that's going to have the code migrator. It's going to have several other tools for deployment, direct deployment to Liferay, and so on. So it includes the migration tool, reports on breaking API changes. You've seen this little, if you were in Dave's talk, you've seen this little UI, which is built in, which is a representation of all of the issues that the migration tool has found in your plugin when you run this against your plugin. And it'll give you a report, it'll give you a problem description, and if possible, it'll give you a mechanism to actually fix the issue. At the very least, it'll tell you what it thinks that you should do to fix the problem. So this should be much more helpful than before. And of course, this entire migrator tool will be modifiable, so we'll be able to add new migrators as we identify these issues. And we're hoping that the community will help us to make this migration tool better and better over time. So Liferay 7 releases week 1, the migrator tool may have 100 issues, but after a month, hopefully as people use it and uncover the issues that we didn't identify, they can contribute those back, and the tool will just get better and better without having to release a new version. This will be just, we're hoping some kind of scheme where we're going to, because this is OSGi based, we're just going to be able to deploy new modules that will be resolved at runtime. When the tool starts, it'll say, "Oh, I have a whole bunch of new migrators that are on the repository. Pull all of those down, install them, and then run with those additional migrators." You run it again. Next day, it finds more and fixes more issues. So Blade Tools is a command line tool which will contain a lot of the archetype kind of things that you would find in a command line tool, such as Spring Boot and so on, to create new projects. It will also help make it possible to do Liferay projects inside other IDEs that are non-Eclipse. Here you can see IntelliJ project, Liferay project mounted in IntelliJ, and it's just a standard Gradle project with APIs and services and service builder and all of that. So you can benefit from whatever IDE by using a command line tool to make a standard project format, whether it be Maven or Gradle. And I believe the tool lets you choose if you want to have a Gradle or a POM based or a Maven based. So the functionality will be accessed from the command line. And then the crux of creating an OSGi bundle, a Liferay 7 module, is the configuration of how the underlying BND library will create the bundle for you. And this is configured through a BND file. Liferay is typically using just bnd.bnd. So when you look inside of any one of our modules, the first thing you'll note is that there's a BND file in there. It's bnd.bnd, and then there's some instructions for how BND should execute. And it might contain the bundle version. It might contain package imports, and these are just a very small excerpt of what kind of instructions are there. It's a very powerful tool. It's actually got a macro processor, and it's extensible itself. So, we've implemented JSP support. We've implemented SAS support, all through BND. And really, the gist, what BND generates is just a manifest file, right? So inside of the jar file that gets created is just the manifest.mf file inside the meta-in folder inside the jar that contains all of the extra headers that are required by an OSGi bundle. So back 10 years ago, the reason why developers became so afraid of OSGi is because this monster file with all this metadata in it became complicated to generate because the tooling just didn't exist or wasn't ready yet. It was evolving still. But today, if you even looked at the Liferay project and you look inside the BND files, there are very, very few instructions there. And typically, you can even, in many cases, you could even just have a blank file, and BND is usually smart enough to figure out everything it needs to do, including all of the package imports that are necessary and the versions and so on, based on just analyzing the class path that was used to compile the bundle. So BND is very, very, very smart, and it basically, you're doing something special when you need to add information into the BND file. And again, reiterating the use of declarative services for the service model, as opposed to using pure OSGi APIs for building your services or building the different components of your application. We're using declarative services very heavily. And if BND, you're using annotations, but the annotations aren't actually processed at runtime. They're build time annotations. So when BND executes and looks at the classes that it sees inside the bundle, it creates an XML file. So declarative services is fundamentally an XML-based component framework, but you never need to look at the XML. You never even need to know it's there. And finally, for the webby part of your application, particularly the JSPs, the CSS, the JavaScript, we've adopted what's known as the web fragment. So in Java EE, there's the notion of a web fragment, which is that in your WAR file, you can put a library in the lib directory of your WAR file that internally, if it contains a meta-inf resources directory, then those resources are visible as web resources. So you can stick, it's kind of like the modular web application design. It's not dynamic in any way, shape, or form, but it's useful in that tooling does support this already. So we're basically flipping the WAR on its head and turning it back into a jar file. Because a WAR really is just a jar file flipped around. The class path is not at the root, it's inside web inf classes, and the root of the bundle is now just a resource directory. And in a web application bundle, it's reverted. In a web resource bundle, it's inverted. It's a jar file that at the root has the class path, and then somewhere internally at a path, there's a resource directory. And that's what we're doing. So we've moved, when we are migrating from a legacy plugin to an OSGi model, we're basically taking everything that's in the root, which would have been in the SDK like doc root, and then you have like your HTML and then all of your JSPs and your CSS. That we're just taking that entire thing and putting it in meta-inf resources, and it's just working the same. And that's it for this part, and I just want to go through, I have a few minutes, and what I wanted to show more than anything else is some real modules. And this is the, okay, I gotta switch screens here. Okay. I give you a little bit of the story of Liferay's conversion. So if you were to look at the Liferay portal source code, this is it right here on GitHub as of right now. So if you'll note a particular folder in there called modules, and this is probably your best source of examples because this has evolved over time, and this is our current bleeding edge best practices all rolled into one. And what you'll note is that we've been busy. There are lots of modules in here. It's a scary number, in fact. Every time I look at it, I think it's over 550 modules now that have been extracted from the core, which is telling of just how monolithic Liferay was to begin with. But the interesting part is, for instance, the application the apps subfolder, which contains the bulk of the real end user functionality that was in Liferay that was extracted. Things like, Amazon rankings and announcements, applications, assets, blogs, bookmarks, blah, blah, and the list is very long. And these are not single modules. These are subtrees containing multiple modules. So for instance, if you look at journal, which is web content, you can see that it's comprised of several submodules. And then there's different. Here, for instance, you'll see that this journal application was decomposed into multiple modules. And here is an example of the OSGi-ified version of a web application. Here, it's not a true Maven source project, but it's very similar in the sense that it's a project that has a source. It has a BND file with some configuration. And then inside the source tree, you have the class path, which is the normal class structure, but inside there you have meta-inf resources. There's some other descriptors in there, and then the JSPs that used to live inside the Liferay core. So as you're converting, this is what you're ultimately shooting for. Now, the next thing I would show, if I could reach the menu, is that we have learned an immense amount of things as we've gone through this process. And it's something that we want to share with you because it's not in our best interest to not convey the knowledge that we've gained during this migration process. And this is basically what the migration tool will try to do for you. We've basically documented the process of taking legacy applications and converting them to the new format. So this is documentation that's not yet released, but it will come, and it's mainly going to be materialized in the migration tool. But we'll probably be good to just literally document this as well so that there's a step-by-step process on how to do this. where if it's here, it should move here, and all of these steps. And finally, last thing I wanted to show is something that I'm hoping to publish fairly soon, and it's basically Liferay's OSGi FAQ. And this was created at it was started at the last Liferay developer retreat, which was in June, or I can't even remember, it was earlier this year. And it basically, when we started to push this to the bulk of our team, they had questions, and I'm sure that you probably have many of the same questions. And as you can see here, there are many, many questions. And so we've documented the answers, and this is something also that's going to be documented. So we want to give you all the ammunition necessary to do this. And there's going to be a workshop this afternoon, which is going to actually do coding around the converting. So please attend if you're interested, and know that we have your best interest at heart. We know this is going to be tough, but we're trying to give you all the ammunition that you can to be successful. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions.
Oh, do we?
Oh, why not? It's lunchtime anyway. If there are any questions.
The examples we've seen are mostly for portlets. Are there any specific suggestions for other types of plugins like hooks, ext, and so on?
Yeah. Yes, there is. The main is, of course, portlets, but there's actually a repository. It's going to be coming to the Liferay organization on GitHub very soon. It's called Blade. And it basically is... We'll publish that publicly so everybody knows about it when it happens, so I wouldn't be too concerned about trying to find it right now, but it's public already. It's just under my name, so on GitHub. But it's called the Blade Project, and it's basically showing how to make all the extension points in just plain old Maven or Gradle or whatnot. And it will actually have everything that was a hook and demonstrating how you would do it in OSGi. And literally, it's going to be like, delete the hook file, delete the web.xml file, put it in a jar, add this metadata to your class, and you're done. It's very, very simple.
One more question over there.
On this side, if you will move to or leave the specification, the portlet specification. So is there a future in Liferay for a specification, portlet specification, or we are just leaving it out and you will have the own way how to develop plugins?
Now, this is interesting because Liferay has already entered discussions, particularly with IBM, who is really the leads of the portlet spec, and particularly with the OSGi side of IBM, who are interested in implementing an OSGi portlet specification. So we're leaving JSR just because the web application, the Java EE model, is not fitting with our needs anymore. So that's why we're getting away from it. But we're going to try and get particularly the portlet API as an OSGi specification. So we're dealing with, again, with the specification. So this... how we've implemented is likely to be very close to, because we'll be probably doing the donating the spec work. And so it should, if we do arrive at a spec, it should look very close to what we have. Very, very likely it will be a service model, and which is what all of the OSGi specifications are tending towards, a whiteboard model, which is what we've already have. So it should be very, very close once we get to that point. I'm hoping to start that process this year. We've already started the discussions for it, though.
Okay, so if there are any more questions, Ray mentioned his workshop this afternoon, so bring them to the workshop. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you.